Athens, the shining jewel of the ancient world. From a distance, it looked like the birthplace of reason, democracy, and philosophy. Marble temples, open debates, men in white robes discussing virtue and truth. But look a little closer, and you'd find another Athens, one driven not just by wisdom, but by wealth. For all its talk about balance and moderation, this was a city obsessed with being seen, and the rich knew exactly how to make sure everyone saw them. The wealthy Athenian didn't just live well, he performed wealth. Everything in his life was designed to send a message. I have power, I have taste, and the gods themselves approve of me. From his house to his clothes, from the way he hosted guests to how he spoke in public, every detail was part of the show. Let's start with where they lived. You might imagine grand villas with courtyards and columns, but in reality, Athenian houses were usually plain on the outside. Simple stone walls, narrow streets, little privacy. But step inside a rich man's home, and it was a different story. Mosaic floors shimmered under torchlight. The walls were painted in deep reds and blues, and perfumes filled the air. There were imported carpets from Persia, fine silver cups from workshops in Corinth, and delicate glassware from faraway Egypt. The message was clear. You didn't even need to shout about wealth. You just needed the right guest to walk through your door. The richest Athenians knew that taste was just as important as gold. The concept of Sophrosine, moderation, and balance was praised publicly. But behind closed doors, balance often meant knowing how to show off without looking like you were trying to. Too much luxury made you seem soft. Too little made you look poor. The trick was to be admired, not envied. And one of the best ways to do that was through food. Dinner parties, symposia, were where reputations were made or destroyed. Imagine this. Guests reclining on cushioned couches, servants moving quietly between them with trays of roasted meat and bowls of honey cakes, music drifting in from the courtyard, and conversations flowing from politics to poetry to scandal. The host didn't just serve food. He staged an experience. Every cup of wine, every story told, every song played was part of the performance. The richer the man, the more subtle his showmanship. Newcomers flaunted gold goblets and peacock feathers. True elites impressed through restraint. They might serve the finest imported wine, but poured from a simple clay jug, as if to say, "This? Oh, it's nothing special." But everyone knew. Everyone always knew. Servants were also part of the image. A wealthy Athenian might have dozens: cooks, cleaners, musicians, scribes, even personal barbers. Slavery was the backbone of their comfort, and the number of servants you owned said more about your status than any public speech. But again, it was about balance. Too many, and people whispered that you were wasteful. Too few, and they wondered if you'd fallen on hard times. Even their clothes sent signals. Men wore fine tunics, woven from soft linen or dyed wool. Expensive colors like deep purple or saffron that only wealth could buy. The dyes came from distant lands, and their rarity made them luxury. Women's clothing was even more extravagant. Layered dresses, gold jewelry shaped like ivy leaves, bracelets carved with tiny gods, and hairstyles that took hours to arrange. But in Athens, even fashion came with a rule. Beauty had to look effortless. To look too perfect was considered vulgar. And of course, nothing announced wealth louder than patronage, funding the city's glory. The richest Athenians were expected to give back, but not quietly. They paid for festivals, sponsored plays, and funded naval ships, not just out of generosity, but for status. When a rich man financed a chorus or built a public monument, his name was carved right onto it. People walking through the city couldn't help but read his contribution out loud. Funded by Demetrius, son of Lycurgus. It was charity, but with branding. In a city that worshipped competition, generosity became another kind of contest. Who could throw the biggest festival? Who could host the most dazzling performance? Who could make the gods and the public take notice. Even religion became a social display. Rich families sponsored sacrifices, parades, and temple decorations. The more lavish the offering, the more people talked about your piety. It was the ancient world's version of virtue signaling, except instead of online likes, you earned statues, songs, and eternal praise. But beneath all this spectacle, something else was happening. A quiet tension between Athens' ideals and its reality. The philosophers preached moderation, simplicity, and balance. Yet the city's elite built their lives around attention, influence, and the subtle art of display. It was a world where morality and image danced side by side, sometimes in harmony, sometimes in conflict. And that conflict was everywhere, in how people spent money, in how they talked about virtue, and in how they treated the poor. Athens wanted to believe it was a city of thinkers, but it was also a city of performers. And nowhere was that more visible than in how its rich lived their carefully constructed lives. Because in Athens, the greatest sin wasn't greed, it was being invisible. Athens loved competition, in politics, in art, in war, and especially in reputation. For the wealthy, life was one long performance, and the entire city was the stage. They didn't just flaunt their riches in private dinners or painted houses. They turned generosity into public theater. Every act of giving was really an act of showing, proof that they weren't just rich, but important. One of the most powerful tools they had for this was public sponsorship, known as the liturgies. The idea was simple. If you were wealthy, the city expected you to fund things, ships, plays, parades, festivals, the kinds of events that defined Athens itself. It was a tax disguised as honor, and no rich man wanted to be the one who said no. Because in Athens, refusing to give didn't make you frugal. It made you forgettable. Take the theater, for example. Every year, during the great festivals of Dionysus, the city exploded with life. Poets competed with new tragedies and comedies, and thousands of citizens crowded into the open-air theater on the southern slope of the Acropolis. But behind every performance, there was a man with money. The Corregos, the sponsor, paid for the chorus, the costumes, the musicians, the rehearsals, the food, everything. It wasn't cheap. But if your play won, you didn't just earn applause. You earned immortality. The winner's name, not the playwright's, was carved on stone monuments around the city. You could walk past one and read, "This performance was sponsored by Nicias," and everyone knew he was the man who brought Athens joy. He wasn't just rich. He was useful. That was how the wealthy stayed admired. They tied their money to Athens' pride. Some took it further. A few Corregoi built monuments in their own honor. Tall marble pillars topped with bronze tripods. One of these still stands today, the Karagic Monument of Lysicrates, built by a man who won first prize and wanted to make sure the city never forgot it. It's beautiful, yes, but it's also pure ego carved in stone. And it didn't stop with theater. The same system extended to war. Wealthy men financed warships called triremes, sleek, fast vessels that formed the backbone of Athens' navy. Funding a ship wasn't just an act of patriotism. It was another way to flex status. The trireme's prow often bore the name of the sponsor, painted boldly for all to see. Imagine your name cutting through the Aegean waves, a floating advertisement of both your wealth and your loyalty. But even as they gave, the rich controlled how they were seen. They didn't want to look like show-offs. They wanted to look honorable, so they invented a kind of ritual modesty. When praised for their generosity, they'd shrug and say it was their duty to the city, all while knowing their name would be etched into marble. Humility became another costume in the performance. Still, not everyone admired them. Ordinary citizens, the ones sitting in the theater seats they funded, saw the game for what it was. They appreciated the festivals, the free entertainment, the feasts, but they also resented how those same men dominated politics, courts, and conversation. Some mocked them openly in the comedies performed at those very festivals. Playwrights like Aristophanes filled the stage with caricatures of pompous, self-absorbed elites, the kind who pretended to serve the public while secretly serving themselves. The audience laughed, but the message landed. Generosity was just another form of control. Because the truth was, wealth didn't just buy admiration, it bought influence. A man who could fund ships and festivals could easily fund votes. Athens was a democracy, yes, but one that ran on favors and appearances. To speak in the assembly, to argue in court, to propose a law, these things required reputation. And reputation required visibility. The more a man gave, the louder his voice became. Even religion wasn't safe from this. The wealthy turned piety into performance. They donated golden vessels to temples, financed sacrifices, and led processions through the city draped in fine robes. Their offerings to the gods were carefully timed and generously public. They didn't just worship, they announced their devotion. The more lavish the gift, the more likely it was to be remembered, and divine favor, conveniently, often came with social favor too. Yet in a city that valued equality, at least for free men, this constant display created tension. Socrates, walking barefoot through the agora, he told the rich that they cared more about polishing silver than improving their souls. But they didn't listen. To them, poverty wasn't a philosophical statement. It was failure. So the show went on. The rich built temples, threw festivals, funded fleets, and hosted symposia, all under the guise of service. And the city, even while rolling its eyes, depended on them. Without their money, there would be no theater, no navy, no games, no sacrifices. Athens liked to believe it was ruled by ideas, but it was really ruled by image. Every man of wealth knew that one truth. If people stopped talking about you, you stopped mattering. And in a city built on reputation, obscurity was the only true poverty. By the height of Athens' golden age, wealth wasn't just something the elite enjoyed. It was something they used. The rich had learned that generosity could buy admiration, but now they discovered it could also buy power. Sponsoring a play or a warship was no longer just civic duty, it was strategy. The city had turned into a quiet battlefield, and reputation was the prize. Every wealthy man wanted to be seen as Athens' greatest benefactor. When one hosted a festival, another tried to outdo him with an even grander one. When one built a monument, another built his higher. What began as patriotism turned into competition, and that competition began shaping the entire culture of the city. The festivals became the clearest display of this arms race. The most famous, the Panathenaic Games, were meant to honor the goddess Athena, but they quickly became a showcase for who could give the most dazzling gifts to the people. Wealthy citizens sponsored parades, musicians, horse races, and athletic contests. The winners earned olive wreaths and glory, but the true victors were the men whose money made it all possible. They filled the streets with processions of dancers, priests, and decorated animals, each carrying offerings to the gods. The fabrics shimmered, the perfumes lingered, and the sound of flutes echoed through the city. People cheered, but everyone knew who paid for the spectacle. The gods were being honored, yes, but so were their patrons. And if the festivals weren't enough, there were the symposia, the private feasts where alliances were built and reputations sharpened. The rich competed in subtle ways there too, who had the most skilled musicians, the best imported wine, or the rarest ivory cups. The trick was to pretend it all came effortlessly. True prestige in Athens wasn't about owning more. It was about owning better. Knowing which wine came from Chios or which sculptor carved your silver bowl showed education, refinement, and power all at once. But under the surface, jealousy simmered. The poor began to notice just how wide the gap had grown. The elite walked through the agora in fine robes while laborers sat in the dust, hoping for work. Athens prided itself on being a democracy, The one built on image and competition could only stay balanced for so long. Some philosophers warned what was coming. Socrates mocked the obsession with luxury, claiming that rich men were slaves to their possessions. Others, like the playwright Aristophanes, made it a public joke, filling the stage with wealthy characters desperate for attention, tripping over their own vanity. The audience laughed, but uneasily. They knew he wasn't exaggerating. The truth was that wealth had become a form of warfare. Political factions formed around the city's richest men, each promising more festivals, more ships, more donations. Votes were swayed not with arguments, but with favors. Even temples became political tools, funded by men who hoped the gods might lend them some moral authority. Athens' ideals of equality began to bend under the weight of its own ego. And as the Peloponnesian War loomed, the contrast between rich and poor only deepened. The rich funded fleets and military campaigns, but they also profited from them. Trade contracts, mining ventures, and supply deals made certain families wealthier than ever, while ordinary citizens paid with their lives. Yet even then, the elite presented themselves as saviors, men whose wealth kept Athens alive. To the people, it was a bitter irony. The same men who built temples for the gods and theaters for the masses were also the ones shaping policy, steering wars, and quietly tightening their grip on power. They spoke of duty and honor, but everyone knew the louder a man praised Athens, the more he was really praising himself. By now, the city's obsession with reputation had turned into something larger than fashion or status. It was identity. To be an Athenian of standing was to be seen, remembered, admired. The marble monuments, the festivals, the public speeches, they weren't about Athens' greatness. They were about the men who built it. The city that once taught the world about balance and virtue was now driven by spectacle. And the wealth that had built its glory was slowly beginning to reveal its cracks. Because in Athens, once you started measuring your worth by how loudly people applauded, you forgot what you were clapping for. As Athens marched deeper into the Peloponnesian War, its marble glow began to crack. The city that once called itself the heart of reason had become a stage for excess, and now that stage was trembling. The same elite who had filled the city with theaters, temples, and festivals were suddenly expected to fund something far less glamorous: survival. At first, the rich handled it like everything else, with performance. They financed warships, supplied armor, and hosted patriotic gatherings to remind everyone how devoted they were to Athens. They stood in front of crowds, declaring sacrifice and honor, while their slaves carried the gold behind them. But war was expensive, and for once, generosity wasn't optional. It was demanded. The city needed their money, not their speeches. Taxes on the wealthy grew steeper, and the liturgies that once brought applause now felt like burdens. Sponsoring plays or festivals became a luxury few could afford when the navy drained every coin. Some elites hid their wealth in foreign investments or bribed officials to avoid service. Others tried to mask their greed by doubling down on public displays, overpaying for monuments or donating supplies they could barely afford, just to keep their image intact. The cracks in Athens' moral armor were showing. The poor had long accepted inequality as part of life. After all, the rich paid for the city's entertainment. But now, with hunger spreading and soldiers dying, that patience wore thin. People began whispering that the great benefactors of Athens weren't heroes at all, but parasites feeding off the system they claimed to support. In the assembly, the tension was impossible to ignore. Men who once competed over who could fund the best festival now accused each other of corruption. Public trials became spectacles of envy and revenge. Being rich in Athens had always meant being visible, but now visibility could destroy you. A generous man might be called noble one year and greedy the next, depending on who shouted louder. And for the first time, the city's love of appearances began to feel dangerous. Behind every act of public generosity was fear. Fear of being forgotten, or worse, condemned. The same men who had built temples to gain glory now faced accusations of impiety and betrayal. Wealth, once a shield, had become a target. The philosophers saw it coming long before the politicians did. Socrates called it the sickness of the soul, a city where men cared more about looking virtuous than being virtuous. He mocked the elite who polished their sandals and words with the same vanity, warning that Athens was losing its balance. But the rich laughed. They could afford to, until they couldn't. The war dragged on, trade slowed, and fortunes began to shrink. The silver mines near Laurium that had funded Athens' prosperity ran dry. Imported luxuries became rare. The grand dinner parties grew smaller, the music quieter. For the first time, the city that once overflowed with noise and laughter started to sound hollow. But even in decline, the obsession with display refused to die. The elite found new ways to flaunt what was left, through funerals, for example. Lavish burials became the final stage for reputation. Marble graves carved with poetic inscriptions, statues of perfect youths or mourning goddesses. They weren't built for the dead, but for the living. Each tomb whispered the same message, "Remember me." And people did. They couldn't look anywhere without seeing the reminders along the roads. Outside the city gates, row after row of beautiful stone faces. It was Athens' most honest art form, grief as self-promotion. By the end of the war, the city was exhausted. Its empire had crumbled, its navy was broken, and its citizens, rich and poor alike, were left asking what had gone wrong. But the answer was there all along. The same hunger for admiration that built Athens' glory had also blinded it. Wealth had turned civic pride into a competition of egos, and the city's ideals, moderation, virtue, reason, had become costumes. The rich still dressed well, still spoke beautifully, still hosted their dwindling banquets, but the tone had changed. The marble glistened, but beneath it there was dust. Athens had built a civilization that taught the world how to think. But in chasing beauty and applause, it had forgotten how to listen to itself. When the Peloponnesian War finally ended, Athens was unrecognizable. Its empire was gone, its walls torn down, and its pride bruised beyond repair. The marble temples still stood, but the people had changed. The air that once hummed with debate and laughter now carried the quiet weight of loss. And for the wealthy, the men who once ruled the city through charm, generosity, and reputation, the silence was deafening. The old way of showing off no longer worked. You couldn't host lavish festivals when half the city was in ruins. You couldn't impress neighbors with imported goods when trade had dried up. For the first time, wealth had lost its audience. The theater of power that once defined Athens, the feasts, the monuments, the contests, had been replaced by something simpler, smaller, and far more uncomfortable: survival. But even then, the rich adapted. They always did. The same families who once spent fortunes on plays and temples began shifting their focus inward. Instead of chasing applause, they started chasing stability, buying land, rebuilding homes, hoarding what silver they had left. For generations, wealth in Athens had been loud. Now it became quiet. Status was no longer proven by how many people saw your generosity, but by how well your family endured the collapse. And slowly, a new kind of pride began to emerge. The city that had worshipped luxury started to rediscover the value of modesty. The philosophers had warned it would come to this, and now their words finally made sense. The idea of virtue began to shift, from how much you could give to how little you needed. Still, habits die hard. Even in recovery, the wealthy couldn't resist leaving their mark. They built smaller homes, yes, but filled them with symbols of memory. Frescoes of old victories, inscriptions of past donations, fragments of ruined monuments repurposed into walls. It was as if they were trying to glue their history back together, piece by piece. They wanted people to remember that Athens had once been glorious, and that they had been part of it. Yet something deeper had changed. The younger generation, born after the war, grew up among ruins instead of gold. They'd heard stories about the great festivals, the famous theaters, the glittering symposia, but to them, those tales sounded less like history and more like legend. The idea that wealth was a performance felt distant, almost foolish. They wanted something different, something real. Philosophers filled the gap the aristocrats left behind. Plato, a student of Socrates, turned Athens' failures into lessons. He wrote about justice, moderation, and the dangers of vanity. He argued that the city's downfall came not from its enemies, but from its obsession with appearance over substance. And while most Athenians never read his works, his ideas began to sink into the culture. Even the rich, still clinging to what little glory they had, started quoting philosophers at their dinners instead of bragging about imported wine. That was Athens after the applause. A city learning, painfully, that beauty without humility breaks under its own weight. But the story didn't end in ruins. The rich families who survived quietly rebuilt the city, not with parades or monuments, but with patience. They funded schools, libraries, and small theaters. The focus shifted from showing off to preserving knowledge, the one thing that couldn't be destroyed or envied. Athens would never again rule the world through ships or gold, but it could still rule it through ideas. And in a strange way, that too was a kind of wealth, one that couldn't be displayed in marble or silk, only in thought. The Athenians had learned their lesson, though not the easy way. They had built a city on pride and display, and it had nearly destroyed them. But what survived, the philosophy, the art, the wisdom, came from what the rich could never buy: perspective. So, when we think about how the wealthy of Athens showed off, it's easy to picture the feasts and the festivals, the silver goblets and marble monuments. But the real story I asked how they flaunted it, it asks how they lost it, and what came after. Because in the end, even the richest Athenians learned the hardest truth of all. Applause fades, marble crumbles, and gold loses its shine, but the lessons you leave behind are what last forever. By the time a few generations had passed, the Athens of golden glory had become a memory. The city still stood, still whispered with the ghosts of poets and philosophers, but the performance was over. The wealthy who once ruled every conversation and festival had faded into something quieter, caretakers of a legacy they didn't fully understand anymore. Gone were the days of lavish processions and glittering symposia. No one had the appetite for that kind of display anymore. Instead of competing over who could build the grandest monument, the rich now competed over who could preserve what little remained of Athens' greatness. They restored shrines, copied old manuscripts, and commissioned small statues of thinkers instead of warriors. What had once been a contest of extravagance turned into a race to be remembered as wise. The irony was almost poetic. The same families that had chased attention with music, gold, and feasts now spent their money chasing humility. Their ancestors carved their names into stone. Their descendants carved their teachers' names instead. The measure of greatness had shifted from how much you owned to how much you understood. The city's energy changed too. In the agora, once filled with merchants and performers, small groups of students now gathered around philosophers. Instead of wine cups and laughter, you heard the slow rhythm of questions and answers. Wealth still existed, of course, but it had learned to speak softly. A rich man was now expected to act like a student, curious, restrained, and thoughtful. It wasn't that greed had vanished. It never really does. But Athens had seen what came of it: the rise, the spectacle, the collapse, and the survivors carried that memory like a scar. They still built houses, but smaller. They still wore jewelry, but simpler. They still hosted dinners, but the talk had changed. Instead of boasting about imported silk, They debated ethics. Instead of comparing ships, they compared philosophies. To the rest of the world, it probably looked like decline. But to Athens, it was something closer to redemption. And yet, you could still feel the echo of the old city beneath it all. The pride, the vanity, the hunger to be seen. It lingered in the marble ruins, in the inscriptions that still bore the names of long-dead benefactors. Those words carved into stone, funded by so-and-so, had outlasted their sponsors. The marble had cracked, but the message survived. I was here. Maybe that's what Athens really wanted all along. Not wealth, not power, but memory. To be remembered. Every monument, every festival, every act of giving had been an attempt to freeze time, to keep the city's story from fading. And in that, the rich had succeeded. Their names might blur, their fortunes might vanish, but the city they built, its art, its thought, its impossible beauty, endured. When travelers centuries later walked through the ruins, they still felt it, that strange mixture of pride and loss. The broken columns, the toppled statues, the faded carvings, they weren't just remnants of luxury. They were reminders of a civilization that had lived too brightly, too loudly, and then learned to live differently. And so, Athens survived, not as the city of gold, but as the city of ideas. The marble cracked, but the words it inspired still moved across the world. Democracy, philosophy, theater, all born in the same place that once obsessed over wealth and applause. That's the real ending to how the rich of Athens showed off. They built a world that was supposed to make them immortal, but in the end, it made their city immortal instead. Because the truth is, every empire leaves behind two things: ruins and lessons. The ruins remind us what they built, but the lessons remind us why it fell. And Athens, loud, brilliant, proud Athens, left both in perfect balance. The marble faded. The money vanished. But the idea of Athens, the pursuit of beauty, wisdom, and meaning, never did.